this chapter, we will explore one of the social problems that receives significant media attention, namely crime, violence, and the criminal justice system. Media presentations seem to imply, and often state directly, that crime is rampant in the United States. However, we will discover that rates and types of crime vary significantly by geographic region, socioeconomic class level, race, gender, and a variety of other social factors. The learning objectives of this chapter include identifying serious crimes as well as trends and patterns in crime rates, defining a number of specific types of crime, discussing the causes and consequences of violence in our society, analyzing the operation of the United States criminal justice system, applying biological and psychological theories to the issue of crime, applying sociological theory to the issue of crime, and finally, analyzing crime and violence from various positions on the political spectrum. As your author states, high-income nations provide a higher quality of life in terms of material culture for their residents. By definition, most residents of high-income nations have larger homes, a greater probability of owning one or more cars, higher levels of education, employment that is done in safer and more comfortable environments, and more disposable income than most residents of low-income societies. Given that, we might expect the crime rate overall to be lower in high-income societies than the rates in low-income nations. In addition, we might expect similarity in the crime rates among high-income nations. However, as this graphic indicates, the frequency of mass murders, which are the intentional, unlawful killing of 4 or more people at one time and place, like the killings at Columbine, varies significantly. Simply, mass murders occur with much higher frequency in the United States than in other high-income countries. During the 36-year period presented in this table, the United States had more incidents of mass murders than the other 8 societies combined and had more fatalities. The question we must ask is, why is the United States a more violent society than other high-income societies? Crime is one category of deviant behavior, and in order to understand it, we need to become familiar with some important sociological concepts. Norms are rules and expectations by which a society guides the behavior of its members. They define what is acceptable behavior for social members. There are 3 categories of norms found in all societies. First, folkways are norms or ideal patterns of behavior that define behavior of relative little importance to society. For example, fashion and etiquette when eating are good examples of folkways. If a person chooses to eat pasta with their fingers in a restaurant, for example, they would certainly get stares and possibly some comments, but violation does not lead to strict official penalties. Ultimately, if we were to change the folkways tomorrow and say that it is appropriate for everybody to eat their pasta with their fingers, it would not mean the collapse of society as we know it. Next, mores are norms which define moral behavior. There is a sense of rightness associated with conforming to the mores, such as the more that prohibits killing a person just because we feel like it. Since most of us accept that murder is morally wrong, we choose not to engage in the behavior. The final category of norm is law, which is a norm that is formally created through a society's political system. When norms are formalized into law, there are specific penalties or punishments that can be assigned after violation. Laws can be divided into 2 categories. Civil law defines legal rights and relationships involving individuals and businesses. When we think of the cases that Judge Judy handles, for example, these involve either violations or alleged violations of civil law. The other category of law is criminal law, which defines everyone's responsibility to uphold public order, which means that we cannot kill others, steal their property, assault them, and so forth. Crime is the violation of a criminal law, and that law could have been enacted by the federal, state, or local government. Therefore, while some laws apply to everyone in the United States, many apply to only single states or municipalities. It is everyone's responsibility to know and follow the law in each jurisdiction. It is often said that ignorance of the law is no excuse for violating it. Laws can be divided into two major categories. A misdemeanor is a less serious crime, punishable by less than a year in prison, and this category includes such offenses as prostitution, public intoxication, trespass, vandalism, and disorderly conduct. Felonies are more serious crimes that are punishable by at least 1 year in prison, and these include such offenses as murder, forcible rape, stalking, and aggravated assault. The legal system in the United States carefully examines the intention of the person or what the person meant to do. For example, if a person attempted to help someone who seemed to be having a heart attack by administering CPR and accidentally cracked a rib which punctured a vital organ and the individual died, the intention of injury could not be established and that person would not be tried for murder. Another important consideration about crime in the United States is that 55% of people think that dealing with crime has to be a top priority for our society. Approximately 10 million serious crimes are reported by the police each year, so this concern and fear is justified to a large extent. Fear of crime is itself a social problem because it limits the things that people do and the places that they go. For example, a third of adults living in the United States say that they're afraid to walk alone at night in their own neighborhoods. Each year, the FBI publishes the Crime in the United States Uniform Crime Report, which provides data about crimes reported to police departments throughout the United States. The report includes data on felonies that are reported in two different categories. Crimes against property are crimes that involve the theft of property belonging to others. These offenses include burglary, larceny theft, motor vehicle theft, and arson. The other category involves crimes against person, which are crimes that involve violence or the threat of violence against others. These crimes include murder and manslaughter, aggravated assault, forcible rape, and robbery. This table provides definitions for each of the 8 types of crimes reported in the Uniform Crime Report. Despite the considerable value of this publication, it is important to note that it has 2 major limitations. First, it only includes crimes reported to the police. To attempt to determine how accurate these statistics are, the FBI conducts the National Crime Victimization Survey, which asks a random sample of adults whether they have been the victim of a crime in the past year. Based on this research, it is estimated that only about a half of violent crimes and a third of property crimes are actually reported to the police. The second limitation of the UCR is that it reports data about street crime, but not elite crimes, such as insider trading, corruption, price fixing, and illegal dumping of toxic waste. We can conclude then that the UCR underestimates crime overall and provides a biased profile of the typical criminal. Violent crimes, or crimes against persons, represent 12% of all serious offenses. The rate of violent crime increased quickly from 1960 until the early 1990s and has declined since then through 2012. Sociologists and criminal justice personnel are interested in explaining the decline. There is general consensus that 4 factors have contributed to the trend. Generally, a strong economy is associated with a lower crime rate, but interestingly, the downward trend continued even during recent economic downturns. In addition, a drop in the use of crack cocaine, the hiring of more police, and tougher sentencing are believed to have contributed to a declining rate of violent crime. Consistent with what we discussed about the rate of violent crime decreasing in the United States since the 1990s, the rate of homicide has been falling since 1993. There are a number of demographic variables that are related to a person's probability of being a murder victim. Specifically, 78% of murder victims are male, 51% are African American, and 46% are white. Murder is largely intraracial, which means that most offenders and victims are of the same race. In addition, 78% of all murder victims knew the offender, and in 23% of the cases, they were related. This is especially true when the victim is female, since 35% of female victims were murdered by husbands or boyfriends. Also, arrests are made in 63% of all reported murders, although not all arrests result in conviction and penalty. Many cases of homicide include a history of the killer stalking the victim, which is why it is so important to report and successfully prosecute stalkers. It can literally be viewed as reducing the probability of subsequent violent crime. Stalking is defined as repeated efforts by someone to establish or reestablish a relationship against the will of the victim. 75% of stalking victims are women, and the offenders are generally former husbands or boyfriends. The next violent crime that we will explore is forcible rape. Nationally, it is estimated that only 28% of women who are raped make a report to the police. Most attackers know their victims, but arrests are made in only 21% of reported cases. Date rape, or sexual assault in which the offender and victim know each other, has been the subject of increasing attention from colleges and universities, and the subject of media attention at several institutions. Statistics include attempted rape and male rape victims also, but not sex with a minor, which is reported separately as statutory rape. Aggravated assault is the most common crime against a person, accounting for 63% of all reported violent crime. A large majority of both victims and offenders are men, so that persons at a bar who become belligerent and attack each other would be examples of persons who might be arrested for aggravated assault. Arrests are made in 51% of the reported cases. Robbery involves stealing and threatening another person, so it is both a property and a violent crime. It is the least likely of all violent crimes to result in an arrest because victims typically do not know the robber. Just 29% of robberies were cleared in 2012 by an arrest. The demographic characteristics of arrested offenders indicate that 87% were male, 62% were under age 25, 55% were African American, and 43% were white. Since 1991, the trend in the robbery rate has been downward. This map illustrates the risk of being the victim of a violent crime by county across the United States. As you can see, persons in most counties have a below-average risk of being victimized. Crime seems to be concentrated in certain areas. How can you explain this pattern? What role, if any, does population density play? In addition to violent crimes, the Uniform Crime Report includes data about property crimes. These crimes occur 7 times as often as violent crimes, or once every 4 seconds. Typically, victims never see offenders, and arrests are made in only 18% of reported cases, compared to 43% of violent crimes resulting in an arrest. According to the FBI, burglary is entry into a building illegally with intent to commit a crime. Only 11% of cases are cleared with arrest, and the majority of those arrested are males and are under the age of 25. The FBI defines larceny theft as the unlawful taking, carrying, or riding away of property from the possession of another that is not taken by force and violence or by fraud. Larceny theft is the most common serious crime, and these offenses comprise 60% of all crimes tracked by the FBI. 16% of cases are cleared, with 43% being the arrest of females. These offenses include shoplifting, purse snatching, embezzlement, forgery, check fraud, and taking items from a car. The FBI defines motor vehicle theft as the theft or attempted theft of a motor vehicle. Only 7.4% of cases are cleared by arrest, and offenders are typically males who are relatively young. Arson is defined as any willful or malicious burning or attempting to burn, with or without intent to defraud, a dwelling, public building, motor vehicle or aircraft, personal property of another, etc. 19% of cases are cleared, and offenders are typically males who are relatively young. The average loss from arson is approximately $13,000. Using FBI data, relationships between criminal activity and several demographic variables can be identified. Age is one important factor. Arrest rates for both violent and property crimes peak in the late teens, and the rates fall dramatically by middle age. Gender is another variable that is strongly related to crime. While males comprise about half of the population, they accounted for 63% of arrests for property crime and 80% of arrests for violent crime. However, female participation in crime varies by category. For example, 43% of the arrests for larceny theft are women, as we previously discussed. 41% of persons arrested for fraud are women. 48% of those arrested for embezzlement are women, and 68% of prostitution arrests are for women. Finally, it is important to note that the gender gap is narrowing for all serious crimes, since the number of arrests of women has increased by 3% and the number of arrests of men has decreased by 3%. Another important variable to explore is social class. Crime rates are high in low-income neighborhoods, but it is important to remember that most crime is committed by a small number of repeat offenders. Most residents of low-income communities are law-abiding persons. Also, as I mentioned before, people in different social classes have different opportunities to commit different crimes. Without a business degree, for example, it is unlikely that a person could embezzle corporate funds, and this offense is less likely to result in reporting, arrest, and conviction than many street crimes. The final demographic variable that we will explore is race and ethnicity. Contrary to popular belief, most street crime arrests involve white suspects. However, in proportion to population share, African Americans, who comprise 13% of the U.S. population, are more likely than whites to be arrested. Specifically, black males are 6 times more likely than white males to spend time in jail, and 1/3 of black men in their 20s are in jail, on probation, or on parole. When individuals are on probation, they are sentenced to a period of court supervision, and if they are on parole, they are under court supervision after their release from prison. These alarming statistics lead to an exploration of causes for the significantly different rates. Simply, or maybe not so simply, why does race play such a large part in the street crime picture? Poverty may play an important role, since more than 1/3 of black children grow up poor, compared to about 1/8 of white children. The deprivation faced by black youths may lead to hostility toward police and distrust of the system. Elijah Anderson uses the term code of the streets to describe this phenomenon, which endorses crime and violence as a way to survive in what is seen as a dangerous society. Another reason for the high crime rate of blacks may be prejudice, which may prompt people to suspect blacks on the basis of skin color. Interestingly, while about the same proportion of black and white people report using illegal drugs, black people are 4 times more likely to end up in jail after a conviction. A third factor to consider is family structure. 72% of black children are born to single mothers, compared to 29% of white children. Generally, single parents have less time to supervise children and earn less, which contributes to the higher rate of poverty that we've discussed. Finally, Asian Americans are underrepresented in street crime statistics. As we explored earlier, as a group, Asian Americans have higher income levels and have a strong cultural emphasis on family, discipline, and honor, which tend to discourage criminal behavior. Beyond those crimes included in the Uniform Crime Report, we will explore 6 additional important categories of offenses. Juvenile delinquency is violation of the law by young people, which typically means someone under the age of 18. Some laws apply only to juveniles, such as curfews and truancy. It is important to remember that the goal of the juvenile justice system is different than that of the criminal justice system. Its goal is to protect the community and to serve the best interests of youthful offenders rather than punishing offenders. Juveniles who are convicted typically are incarcerated at a juvenile detention center rather than an adult prison, and are released when they become adults, usually between the ages of 18 and 21. For serious offenses, juveniles can be tried and sentenced as adults, but since 2005, they cannot be sentenced to death. A hate crime is a criminal offense against a person, property, or society motivated by the offender's bias against a race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, ethnicity, or national origin. Since 2009, the federal government can investigate and prosecute hate crimes in localities that do not have such laws or are unable or unwilling to apply them. 45 states and the federal government mandate additional penalties for offenses that meet the criteria of a hate crime. However, many hate crimes are not reported. Some police organizations do not record or submit hate crime data, and many victims are reluctant to report the offenses. Based on federal data, it is clear that racial bias is the most frequent reason for a hate crime. Interestingly, 24% of hate crimes based on race targeted white people. Also, it is significant to note that the odds of being a victim are especially high for people with multiple disadvantages, such as gay men of color or persons from minority groups with disabilities. White-collar crimes are illegal activities committed by people of high social position during the course of their employment or regular business activities. Examples of white-collar crime include fraud, which is obtaining money under false pretenses, insider trading, which is using restricted company information as the basis for a personal decision to buy or sell stock, or embezzlement, which is illegally taking money from one's employer. As evidence that the existence of white-collar crime is not new, Edwin Sutherland in 1940 identified several facts about white-collar crimes. First, he said that white-collar crimes are far more common than people imagine, and they often receive little public attention because the victims want to conceal them. Finally, when incidents are reported and an arrest is made, cases are usually heard in a civil court, and if convicted, offenders rarely go to jail. Corporate crime refers to unlawful acts committed by a corporation or by persons acting on its behalf. One example of a corporate crime is gross negligence, whereby a corporation knowingly produces a faulty or dangerous product, such as the Ford Pinto. It is critical to note that once the company knew that rear-end collisions could rupture the gas tanks, they refused to order a recall since they believed it would be cheaper to pay the legal claims from future accidents. They were wrong, but some people died and others were badly burned because of their decision. The cost of white-collar and corporate crime is far greater than the cost of all property crimes in a year, but they do not receive the day-to-day media attention and FBI analysis that other categories of crimes do. Organized crime refers to business operations that supply illegal goods and services, such as gambling, sex, or drugs, which expanded greatly during Prohibition. In 1970, Congress passed the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organization Act, RICO, which gives police the authority to seize property used in the commission of crimes involving gambling, prostitution, loan sharking, or illegal drugs. Since then, organized crime has become increasingly multinational. Drug trafficking, pirate CDs and DVDs, weapons sales, identity theft, and human slavery are among the criminal activities of organized crime on a global level. Victimless crimes refer to offenses that directly harm no one but the person who commits them, such as gambling, prostitution, drug use, public drunkenness, and vagrancy. Victimless crimes, however, can and do cause harm. The person committing the crime is often a target for others, including prostitutes and johns, and they are frequently reluctant to report crimes to the police. Also, if you have a family member who is addicted to drugs or gambling, I imagine you will agree that there are victims of this criminal behavior besides the individual involved in it. Violence is behavior that causes injury to people or damage to property, and is clearly a component of many types of crime. However, it is also part of non-criminal social behavior, such as in sports and war. Whether a society defines a specific violent behavior as a social problem depends on 4 variables. The first consideration is the intention of the person who is acting violently. A football player who violently tackles another player without violating any rules of the game, but causing an injury to the other player, would not be defined as a criminal, since the injury was not intentional. The second consideration is whether or not the violence conforms to or violates social norms and values. Many sports, including football and hockey, involve violent behavior that is strongly supported by fans. The third consideration is whether the violence supports or threatens social order. Professional sports involve financial benefits which support social order, but violent attacks of drunken customers in a bar threaten social order. The final consideration is whether the violence is committed by or against the government. Generally, people accept government-initiated violence, such as war, capital punishment, and the activities of a SWAT team, as measures that protect the public. These actions are defined as institutional violence. A very different category of violence is anti-institutional violence, or violence directed against the government in violation of the law. For example, the terrorist attacks on 9/11. Given different political philosophies and values, there is often disagreement about whether specific acts are institutional or anti-institutional violence. There's no doubt that the following types of violence are defined as social problems in the United States. Mass murder is the intentional, unlawful killing of 4 or more people at one time and place. Sadly, mass murders occur in schools, businesses, or homes, where people often assume they are safe from violence. Given that the death toll from mass murder in the United States is approximately 50 people per year, it is not a statistically significant crime, but it receives extensive media attention. Mass murderers are almost always men, including students or ex-students, employees or ex-employees, or family members who believe they have been rejected and are emotionally distraught. Many mass murderers own multiple guns. Another type of killing is serial murder, which is the killing of several people by one offender over a period of time. A serial killer, by definition, is a successful killer, since he is able to avoid punishment for multiple murders, at least for a while. Often the media assign titles to serial killers based on the location of the crimes, characteristics of the victim, or the like. Almost all serial killers are men, and most suffer from a psychosis that reduces their ability to experience empathy and compassion. The mass media include television, radio, movies, and the internet, and most researchers agree that they have a powerful impact on the way people view the world, especially young people. Further, most researchers agree that watching violence may encourage people to be more violent and desensitize people to violence, so that we become so used to violent images that they no longer affect us. We are basically numb to them. A New Zealand researcher studied over 1,000 people for 26 years and found a significant link between the extent of childhood television watching and aggressive personality disorders and criminal convictions. Okay. Many people blame the problem of crime on the easy availability of guns. 34% of U.S. households have at least one gun, and 37% of these weapons are handguns, which is the type of gun most commonly used in homicides. Gun violence is the leading cause of death for African American and Latino males aged 15 to 34, so reducing gun violence would provide significant benefits to minority communities. As this figure illustrates, guns are used in 2/3 of homicides in the United States, and handguns are used in almost half the murders that are committed. As you may know, issues related to gun ownership are hotly debated, with two clearly defined political philosophies. Liberals support restricting the availability of handguns, requiring trigger locks, and banning military-style assault rifles. Conservatives, on the other hand, focus on the constitutional right to keep and bear arms. They argue that guns help to protect law-abiding citizens from criminals, since the possibility of using a weapon may deter crimes. Cross-cultural comparisons are difficult, including the information in the text about Canada, since a multitude of variables affect guns and violence, including the number of citizens who own guns, the rate of violence in the society overall, and the punishment given for crimes committed with guns. As this map illustrates, states vary in their policy about citizens carrying concealed weapons, with most states permitting persons to carry a concealed weapon with a state-issued permit. What regional pattern can be seen for states that require no permit for carrying a concealed weapon? The criminal justice system is society's use of due process, involving police, courts, and punishment to enforce the law. A fundamental component of the criminal justice system in the United States is due process, which means that it must operate within the bounds of law. There are a set of multiple rights that defendants have as part of the due process itself. First, the accused have a right to confront their accusers and defend themselves. Next, they have a right to legal counsel. They also have a right to a speedy, impartial, and public trial with a jury if desired. The person can refuse to testify against himself or herself. A person cannot be tried twice for the same crime. The person has protection against excessive bail, and also has protection against cruel and unusual punishment. Police represent the first official response to crime. However, they cannot intervene in every observed or reported criminal activity. Therefore, they must use their discretion or judgment about whether to intervene in a particular situation. Research from 5 U.S. cities conducted by Smith and Visser found that 6 factors guide the police in their arrest decisions, and I imagine that none of the factors will surprise you. First, police consider how serious the crime is. The more serious a situation is, and the more violence there is, or the more likely there will be violence, the greater the probability of an arrest. Secondly, if the victim wants an arrest, the police are more likely to make one. Third, if the suspect is cooperative, the police are less likely to make an arrest. Next, if the suspect has a criminal record, he or she is more likely to be arrested. Another factor is whether there are bystanders watching. Police are more likely to make an arrest when there are, in order to move the situation away from the street. Finally, the researchers found that African Americans and Hispanic suspects are more likely to be arrested than whites. There have been 2 changes in police policy that have contributed to a reduction in urban crime rates in the United States. First is community policing, which involves making police more visible, for example, by walking a beat or using bicycles. Secondly, zero tolerance policy exists, in which police respond to any offense, regardless of how minor, including jaywalking and traffic offenses. Supporters believe that this deters other criminal behavior, since people understand that penalties will be imposed for any violation of the law. Approximately half of persons who are arrested are later released. The others are formally charged and move through the criminal justice system. Contrary to popular thought, 97% of criminal cases are settled through plea bargaining, which is a negotiation in which the state reduces the defendant's charge in exchange for a guilty plea. This saves the time and expense of a trial, but relying too heavily on plea bargaining can take away a defendant's constitutional right to a trial. There are significant concerns about equity in the court system, since lower-income defendants often cannot afford attorneys and must rely on court-appointed public defenders, who are typically inexperienced and highly motivated to close cases. Often they do not provide a strenuous defense and encourage a plea agreement regardless of the potential strengths of the case. When defendants are convicted or plead guilty to a crime, the punishment phase of the criminal justice system begins. In 2012, more than 2.3 million people were incarcerated in the United States, almost 5 times the number in 1980. As figure 6.4 illustrates, the U.S. imprisons a larger share of its population than any other country. Punishment of offenders is used for a variety of purposes. First, retribution or revenge is often part of punishment. Society wants to inflict on the offender suffering comparable to that caused by the offense, and punishment may make citizens feel good. Next, deterrence is a goal, in which we use punishment to discourage further crime. There is both specific deterrence to the individual, so he or she will not commit the crime again, and general deterrence, in which everyone learns what will happen if they commit a crime. Many people are not caught and punished when they commit a crime, however, so deterrence is not as effective as it might be. The third goal of punishment is rehabilitation, or reforming an offender to prevent future offenses. This goal emphasizes the possibility of positive changes in offenders if the criminal justice system can design appropriate programs for them. The final goal of punishment is societal protection, or protecting the public by using incarceration or execution to prevent an offender from committing further offenses. Simply, an inmate cannot murder or steal from a conforming citizen if he or she is behind bars. Given that the majority of inmates are eventually released, however, the experience that they have in prison may influence their behavior after release, and often not in a positive way. Beyond exploring the purpose of punishment, the critical question is whether it works. There is an increasing criticism of mass incarceration, with an unprecedented 2.3 million people behind bars. If we argue that punishment should deter crime and rehabilitate offenders, why do we have such a high rate of recidivism, or later offenses committed by people previously convicted of crimes? It seems that approximately 1/3 of inmates released from prison are back in jail within 3 years. Both conservatives who focus on the high cost of incarceration and liberals who emphasize the violence of prison life, the effects on families of incarceration, and the overrepresentation of minorities in prison are increasingly critical of the mass incarceration in the United States, with 2.3 million persons in prison. Restorative justice and community-based programs are relatively recent responses to crime in the United States. Restorative justice is a response to crime seeking to restore the well-being of the victim, offender, and larger communities which are lost due to crime. Victims share their loss and feelings, and offenders are encouraged to understand their crime and take responsibility for their actions. There are also correctional programs located in society as a whole rather than behind prison walls. These programs are less expensive than prisons, and offenders avoid the stigma of prison. There are 3 principal types of community correctional programs. Probation refers to the policy of letting a convicted offender stay in the community with regular supervision under conditions imposed by a court, such as drug testing, drug or mental health treatment participation, and avoiding contact with persons with criminal records. Any violations can result in imprisonment. Shock probation mixes prison and probation, since a substantial prison sentence is given, with only a portion to be served in prison or a special boot camp facility. The goal is to teach discipline and respect for authority. Finally, parole is the policy of releasing inmates early to serve the remaining sentence under close supervision. A parole board reviews inmates who are eligible, and if released on parole, offenders can be returned to prison if they fail to comply with the conditions of the parole. Unfortunately, many inmates released on parole are arrested for other crimes. The death penalty, also known as capital punishment, is a policy that has come under critical review in the United States. 18 states have abolished it, with 6 having done so since 2006. Much of the concern is based on the execution of innocent people and the overrepresentation of persons from racial minorities and the poor who receive the death sentence. Specifically, between 1977 and 2014, more than 8,000 people were sentenced to death, and over 1,300 executions were carried out. The trend in sentencing offenders to the death penalty is downward. For example, in 2013, 80 death sentences were handed out and 39 executions took place, compared to 224 death sentences and 80 executions in 2000. 47% of all death row prisoners are in Texas, California, and Florida. Interestingly, 65% of U.S. adults support the death penalty in cases of murder, and only 2% of persons convicted of murder are executed. Beyond considering capital punishment in the United States, it is important to consider it on the global level. This map identifies 58 countries and territories in which the law allows the death penalty for ordinary crimes. In 7 more, the death penalty is reserved for special crimes under military law or during times of war. There is no death penalty in 98 countries and territories. In the remaining 35 countries, although the death penalty remains legal, no execution has taken place in more than 10 years. Compare rich and poor countries. What general pattern do you see? In what way are the United States and Japan exceptions to this pattern? While 32 states permit capital punishment, as I mentioned, 47% of all prisoners on death row are in 3 states, California, Texas, and Florida. What regional pattern do you see? How can you explain this pattern? One of the most frequently asked questions is, why does crime exist? Why is it that some people violate norms in every society? Researchers have explored three major categories of responses, namely biological, psychological, and sociological theories. We will begin by briefly discussing the biological causes of crime. Early research into biological causes argued that some physical characteristics are more commonly found among criminals than non-criminals, such as body type. Sheldon, in 1949, argued that males with more athletic bodies were overrepresented among criminals. However, there are limitations to this theory. First of all, it is possible that society expects muscular males to be more independent and risk-taking, which leads to the self-fulfilling prophecy. Also, it is important to remember that not all persons who violate the law are institutionalized. As we have discussed, white-collar criminals are less likely to serve time in prison, and their body type would be largely irrelevant to their criminal activity. Possibly then, physical theories of crime are biased or non-representative by the nature of persons who end up being imprisoned. In the 1960s, researchers began to explore a possible connection between genetics and criminal behavior. They found that men with an extra Y chromosome may have a greater chance of engaging in criminal violence. In addition, neuroscientists have found that there are differences in the prefrontal cortex of the brain between criminal and non-criminal individuals. This is the section of the brain that controls emotional impulses. It is important to note, however, that brain development involves both a biological process as well as environmental factors. Ultimately, then, we can conclude that biological theories do not provide an adequate understanding of criminal behavior, at least not at this time. Psychological theories of crime argue that personality influences criminal behavior. Reckless and Dinitz in 1956 found that teachers were able to identify 12-year-old males who were likely to get into trouble with the law and those who were not. The researchers found that those who were not likely to get into trouble had a more positive self-concept and a stronger conscience. Despite all of the boys living in a high delinquency area, those who were identified as good boys had many fewer contacts with the police. While psychological theories provide insight into crime, they have two important limitations. First, many serious crimes are committed by people who are quite normal and do not have any identifiable psychological abnormalities. Second, psychological theories consider only the individual, not how society influences them, and this influence can be considerable. Given that this is a sociology class, as you might imagine, we will focus on the sociological theories of criminal behavior. Each of the major theoretical perspectives has multiple theories. As we discussed before, structural functional analysis explores how any social pattern contributes to the operation of society. Simply, what function does the behavior or institution perform in contributing to the stability of society? Emil Durkheim identified the functions of crime, or the ways in which it contributes to social stability. He identified four functions. First, crime affirms a society's norms and values. Next, crime helps us recognize the line between right and wrong. When someone is punished for a violation, it helps us to understand what behavior to avoid. A simple example is seeing a driver get a ticket. That makes most of us slow down, at least for a little while. Third, reacting to crime helps bring people together in a sense of anger and unity. And finally, crime encourages social change, since society may begin to examine norms, especially if there's widespread violation, such as with marijuana usage. According to structural functionalists, therefore, crime is a normal and necessary element of society and performs these four functions that contribute to social stability. The next structural functional theory that we will explore is Robert Merton's strain theory. He argues that patterns of rule breaking depend on whether or not people accept society's goals and whether society provides the opportunity to individuals to reach these goals. According to his theory, there are 5 specific outcomes or patterns of behavior that can result, namely conformity, innovation, ritualism, retreatism, and rebellion. In order to understand his theory, you have to free yourself of the traditional meanings of the various terms. For example, conformity often has a negative implication associated with it, implying repetition and a lack of creativity. On the other hand, innovation oftentimes implies something very creative and something very positive. Yet in Merton's system, reactions are going to be very different than those kinds of traditional usages. First of all, when we look at this particular chart, we should consider that each society establishes cultural goals, or those positive things that they encourage individuals to work toward. The principal cultural goals in the United States, according to Merton, involve financial success. And as we will see, we have a choice as individuals to either accept that cultural goal or to reject it. The other consideration in his theory is the conventional means that are available in order for individuals to achieve these goals. And in the United States, our conventional means involve formal education, which provides us with more credentials, and also long-term employment. The longer we work, the more money we should make, and the closer we come to achieving that financial success. And again, individuals can either accept or reject the conventional means of working toward goals. Now, given that that's the way that society is established, again, his system indicates that there are 5 different ways that individuals can fit into that system. First, we can talk about conformity, in which the individual accepts both the cultural goals and the conventional means to achieve them. These are individuals who form the ultimate foundation of society. They are persons who accept that they want to achieve financial success and they are willing to work hard in order to do so, get an education, and have long-term productive employment. There are individuals who fall into an interesting category called ritualism. Ritualists are persons who basically, on an individual level, reject the cultural goal, who ultimately say, I'm not interested in making a lot of money and living in a big home and driving an expensive car, but I'm very comfortable with the conventional means that are typically used by individuals who are working toward those goals. And so these individuals develop a very conforming lifestyle. They're using the conventional means, but without the goal of amassing substantial amounts of property. Next, we can talk about innovators. Innovators are individuals who accept the cultural goals, say, I want financial success, but for a variety of different reasons, they are not able to accept or achieve the conventional means of working toward those goals. And so innovators are quite literally the principal category of criminals when we think of them. So these are persons who are willing to violate the law in order to achieve personal success. They will steal, they will embezzle, they will do whatever it takes to increase their individual personal success. So again, when we think of criminals, this is a good category to bear in mind. Next, there are retreatists. And retreatists are individuals who basically have pretty much tuned out and dropped out. They reject both the cultural goals and the conventional means of working toward them. And oftentimes, these individuals will have delinquent lifestyles. They may be chemically dependent. And so they're not participating in an effective way in the conventional means, nor are they working toward achieving cultural goals. The 5th category is ultimately the one that Merton argues we know the least about and is possibly the most interesting. These are rebels. Rebels are individuals who reject the cultural goals, but not simply on an individual level. They ultimately say we need different social goals. Everybody should be working toward different goals. And they're struggling and working toward developing new means to achieve those goals. So when we consider at one extreme level terrorist groups, they would fall into the category of rebellion. We could also talk about the early colonial patriots as falling into the category of rebels, because they were rejecting the cultural goals and conventional means that were established by Great Britain and attempted to continue in the United States. The next theory we will discuss is Cloward and Olin's opportunity structure theory. According to the theory, becoming a criminal depends on whether or not individuals have access to legitimate opportunities, such as a good education or good job, or illegitimate opportunity, such as the chance to learn how to carry out criminal behavior. They argue that patterns of conformity and criminality depend on people's relative opportunity structure. If they have access to legitimate opportunities, they may get a good education and a conforming job. If they do not, but have access to illegal opportunities or illegitimate opportunities, they may become criminals, such as prostitutes or thieves, where they learn a criminal behavior from others. Cloward and Olin argue that when a person does not have access to either types of opportunity, he or she may express frustration through violence. The final structural functional theory that we will address is Travis Hershey's control theory. He argues that strong social ties through being well integrated into the community discourage crime. He believes that social ties operate to control crime by attachment to other people, access to conventional opportunity, which means that people can benefit from playing by the rules, involvement in conventional activities such as employment, religion, and sports, and belief in the rightness of cultural norms and values, which contributes to respecting authority figures and following rules. As you can see, maintaining strong social ties helps a person feel connected to society and experience less of a need or desire to violate its norms. When we attempt to evaluate structural functional theories, we find that among its strengths, its argument that crime and other forms of deviance perform some positive function for society is a definite strength. Also, its recognition that crime cannot be understood by only examining individuals is a strong, positive contribution to understanding deviance as well. However, many questions remain unanswered by these theories, such as, while some crime is necessary, how much is needed? What kinds are needed? As I'm sure you'll agree, there's a big difference between eating spaghetti with your fingers in a restaurant and assaulting a person, yet both are examples of deviance. Merton's theory assumes that there's a strong consensus that financial success should be the principal goal, but is that a correct assumption about the United States? Cloward and Olin's theory cannot explain white-collar crime, and none of these theories explain why society defines some lawbreakers as criminals and others as not. The symbolic interaction theory argues that people learn criminal behavior just as they learn other behaviors from their environment. What is defined as a crime and who is defined as a criminal result from a highly variable process of social definition. As we have seen, for example, upper-income persons, regardless of the offenses of which they are suspected, have less of a probability of arrest, conviction, or imprisonment. The first symbolic interaction theory that we will discuss is Edwin Sutherland's differential association theory. According to Sutherland, since learning takes place in social groups, whether one learns deviance or not depends on the extent of his or her contact with those who discourage conventional behavior and encourage deviance. Simply, if you want to know what a person is like, find out what his or her friends and acquaintances are like. Next, Howard Becker's labeling theory argues that the only real definition of rule breaking is behavior that people label that way. No action is clearly right or wrong in any absolute sense. Even taking a human life, for example, is acceptable in certain circumstances, such as self-defense, and commendable in others, for example, in some combat situations. Lemaire distinguished primary and secondary deviance and argued that individuals can be changed by the labels that people apply to their behavior. Simply, primary deviance is deviant behavior committed by someone who is seen to be a conforming member of society. If it becomes known that he or she skipped school or was involved in a DUI, the social reaction is the behavior was wrong, but we're sure that they learned their lesson from it. Secondary deviance, on the other hand, is deviance by an individual who has been labeled a deviant. The label itself reduces conformity-producing influences because conforming people choose not to have contact with the deviant, which means that if they associate with anyone, it will likely be other deviants, which increases the probability of additional deviant behavior. The labeling process relates directly to Erving Goffman's theory about the power of stigma. A stigma is a powerful negative social label that changes a person's self-concept and social identity, such as the label prostitute, criminal, or drug addict. As we discussed about the effects of labeling, once stigmatized, an individual may find that conventional friends disappear, which increases the probability that a deviant career will develop. Often a criminal prosecution is a powerful ritual that publicly stigmatizes an individual. Also, being seen in handcuffs or a prison uniform contributes to the stigma of being a criminal. In addition to structural, functional, and symbolic interaction theories, conflict theories also explore crime. Their theories emphasize how social inequality is related to crime, since issues such as where police patrol, what penalties are assigned to specific crimes, and who is arrested are related to social class. Karl Marx related crime to social class and argued that crime is a result of unequal access to power, property, and prestige, which is an inherent component of capitalism. Since the wealthy benefit from the current distribution of property, the legal system is structured to continue their advantaged position, according to Marx. Therefore, significant changes will only occur if capitalism is eliminated and a more egalitarian society is created. There are two significant limitations to the Marxian theory of crime. First, it may explain crimes committed by lower-income persons, but it does not explain white-collar and corporate crime. In addition, if crime is the result of inequality in society, socialist nations, which have less inequality, should have virtually no crime, but they do. The final theory that we will explore is feminist theory, which explores the relationship between gender and crime. This theory is strongly related to the conflict approach, since it recognizes that men as a group have greater power, property, and prestige than women. With less access to good jobs and positions of power, some women see crime as a means of coping with their exploitation and as a way to make a living. Also, police are far more likely to arrest women working as prostitutes than men who pay for sex, who are also violating the law. Finally, as we have discussed, women are at high risk of sexual violence, with one study reporting that 1 in 5 college women is a victim. A significant limitation of feminist theory is that in a society apparently dominated by males, men are more likely to be imprisoned than women. Crime has virtually always been of great concern, but persons with different political philosophies view the problem quite differently. Conservatives argue that people raised in strong, law-abiding families are less likely to commit crime. Further, they support tougher laws, more aggressive policing, and harsher penalties as ways to combat crime. They believe that crime can be controlled when parents teach children to make the right choices in a world which often encourages deviant behavior. Liberals, on the other hand, claim that many people live in situations that pressure them to break the law. For example, if a person lives in a poor community, has a substandard public school education, poor access to health care, and limited opportunities for decent jobs, he or she may conclude that crime presents the greatest opportunity for financial success. Therefore, improving living conditions for the poor should be a priority and should be viewed as a crime prevention strategy. The final political philosophy that we will discuss is the radical left, which claims that economic insecurity is the real violence carried out against people every day, since many lower and middle income people have lost their jobs, homes, and acceptable health care. According to these theorists, the solution must begin with a restructuring of the economic and political system so that a more egalitarian social order can be created, which will increase social justice and reduce crime.